Back in his native England in the 1960s, Cedric had great success racing minis on some of Britain's major circuits. He emigrated to Canada 20 years ago. But then Parkinson's disease struck, stiffening his limbs and making movement difficult. Now it takes 16 to 20 pills a day to give him control over his body. And the dosage has to be tuned precisely.
If it cuts in good, I'm as fit and agile as anyone. I can run, jump, anything like that. But when you're stiff, you're just as stiff as a board, and if you're a little bit over, my head's flopping all over, there's no control over my muscles. People say, you know, relax. I can't relax, there's no connection. My head can't tell my arm and leg to relax. It's just locked solid until the medication works through.
Just relax your head, let it go loose. Okay, very good. Now just open and close your hands, would you please?
Cedric was recently one of the Parkinson's patients volunteering for a study conducted by John Stossel and his colleagues at the University of British Columbia Hospital.
Now open and close your left hand.
Like Andrew Luchter at UCLA, John Stossel planned a study of real drugs, but he ended up instead with startling new evidence about how placebos affect the brain.
Legs go loose here.
The tests Cedric's going through are standard for assessing the severity of a patient's impairment due to Parkinson's. His right side is more affected than the left, showing up mostly in his slow and difficult movements, but also, especially when he's stressed, in the tremor most of us associate with Parkinson's.
But tremor is often not a prominent feature. Even though it's a very common feature, it's often not the most prominent feature for people, and in fact, it is very uncommon for it to be the disabling feature of Parkinson's. The disabling feature is the poverty of movement, slowness of movement.
It's rare that I shake. See, it's very rare. The only time I notice it is on the transition of the medication.
Yes,
when it's coming on and going off, you may get a little bit of wee bit of that, but it could be any other part of the body, and then it just settles down when it goes in. And generally, I should be good for 3 hours with the medication I take.
The medication is levodopa, which in Cedric's brain helps replace dopamine, one of the brain's communication chemicals and essential for controlling movement.
When we start treatment for Parkinson's, people get a good response for several years, but after a few years, they get into trouble, often with the benefit of the medication wearing off before the next dose is due. So we were doing studies to try and better understand why that might occur, and those studies involved looking at the amount of dopamine that's actually available to the nerve cell.
Measuring how much dopamine is released in response to medication involves a trip to the hospital basement.
Here we are, positron emission tomography.
Yes.
Where Cedric has spent long hours lying in the PET scanner.
Oh, the bed knows me.
It does, yeah.
During this time, his head must be perfectly still. A mask that's flexible when warm and can be molded to his face dries into a rigid head restraint.
It's going to harden to the shape of your face. This one's hardening quick. Okay, so keep your eyes closed.
Parkinson's is one of those conditions like depression that in many patients can be alleviated, at least for a while, by a placebo. So it was especially important to include in the trial of active dopamine-releasing drugs a placebo control.
They were told explicitly that they would be receiving 3 or 4 injections of drug, one of which would be an inert substance. They were not told in which order those injections were to be given.
As expected, the PET scan showed an increase in dopamine release in the brains of subjects receiving an active drug. But what was not expected was that there was just as big a dopamine release in the brains of some patients like Cedric Bell when the injection was of an inert placebo, a saline solution.
It was initially certainly a big surprise, and then when we stopped to think about it, it became somewhat less of a surprise. in that it's been recognized for many years that dopamine is somehow involved in reward mechanisms in the brain. So when we have things that we enjoy or that we look forward to, drug addicts, for instance, get their reward related to dopamine release. And so if you think about it, the placebo effect has everything to do with the expectation of benefit, and that, I think, could be very analogous to reward.
Okay, we're going to bring you out now. You did well.
Making the Vancouver study even more remarkable was the fact that the placebo resulted in dopamine being released in precisely the same place in the brain as the real drugs release dopamine, just where it's needed to activate the pathway that controls movement.
You did really well. Thank you. Let's have a look.
And to top it off, volunteers like Cedric, whose PET scans revealed dopamine release in response to the placebo, also improved when run through the standard test battery.
Big, powerful movements.
Again, just as you'd expect if he'd received active medication.
So you're a little better than you were
Yes,
earlier.
a little bit better.
What about this one?
I think this is really a tremendous example of the mind controlling the body. I mean, those of us who work in neuroscience regard these as closely linked. We don't really think that there's something different about the mind. But this is really the classic example of how your expectation of something, your attitude towards something, can materially affect the physical outcome. That it's not just loosely how you think about whether or not you responded, that there is actually a physical explanation.
It's like trickery, you know. They tell you that you've given you a whiskey, but they haven't. It's quite surprising that things turned out like that. You know, for to take something that activates your dopamine cells, and it isn't supposed to do anything like that at all, is truly amazing.